Hey everyone, this is Jay, and welcome to my April reading wrap-up. So similarly to last month, I did a little bit of traveling at the beginning of this month. Instead of Canada this time, I went to Mexico. So tropical, sunny, surprisingly cold. Plus we went during spring break, so it was really, really crowded. But still overall quite fun. What that means is I have another new background. Voila! This one is semi-outside, trying to spice it up a little, just for you. But I also know that you're not really here for my top-tier background photos. So moving right along, on to the books. So the first book that I finished in April was Murder by Degrees by Ritu Mukerji. This is a historical mystery novel about a lady doctor at the turn of the 20th century. A maid that's close to her is found murdered, and she's drawn into the case to assist. I gotta say, this book is tremendously mediocre. I forgot the plot pretty much immediately after reading it, to the point where I was trying to write down what I had read. I want to say like one day after completing it, and it took me 5 minutes to remember what the hell had happened. I didn't really enjoy it, but I didn't dislike it enough to put it down either. It was just very something to do. There was a lot of drama involved in the events, but not in a way that the reader really gets swept up in. Instead of making the book engaging, it made the events seem really absurd and outlandish. A lot of the characters' choices and actions just didn't really make sense given their characterization, but I honestly didn't feel strongly enough about the book to even care that much. Just a really meh book all around. I gave it a low 3. One thing I will say in its favor, though, is it is a standalone mystery novel, which, if you're familiar with this genre of historical mystery, is very, very rare. The caveat here is it was only published in 2023, so it's only been out for, let's say, a year now at most, and I can't 100% say that this is going to be a standalone forever. After that, I completed The Revolutionary Samuel Adams by Stacy Schiff. This is a nonfiction biography of the life of Samuel Adams, focusing on the period just before the USA's Revolutionary War against Britain. I'm going to be honest, I did not really want to read this. It was recommended to me by my partner's mother, and there was otherwise no way that I was ever going to pick this up because I just didn't have the interest. And my gut was right, because this book was a bit of a snooze fest. My main takeaway was that Sam Adams was actually kind of super skeevy in his methods, and I don't really respect him. The first 50 pages of the book are all over the place and don't really follow any discernible narrative. The reader has no idea what to expect. Going forward, it kind of jumps all over the place temporally and tonally, so I couldn't get a read on it at all for the first pages. The writing also felt very dry to me, and nothing really happened throughout the entire book. The vast majority of the book is just recounting the libel, lies, and mudslinging of prominent Bostonian men, disparaging the other faction. Every now and then, a significant event would be covered, like the Boston Tea Party or the ride of Paul Revere, but a few pages later, we'd be back to the just lies and infighting, which I just do not give a shit about. I think this book could have been a lot more interesting had Samuel Adams' character undergone more scrutiny for his role as a champion of morality and the revolution via such unscrupulous means, but at no point did the author take any kind of stance, nuanced or otherwise. Overall, this book really just emphasized to me the importance of being interested in the outset of what a nonfiction book is about. If I'm not interested in a topic, then I'm infinitely less interested in reading about it, especially given that much of the book was already known to me, having gone through the pro-America propaganda machine known as the U.S. public education system. At the end of the day, apologies to my partner's mom, but I gave this one a subjective 2 stars. Following Sam Adams, I wrapped up The Mystery of the Blue Train by Agatha Christie. I told you, I was traveling. This is another Poirot novel because Poirot is my favorite, and I'm currently reading through the Poirot series, so there are always Poirot novels. But it's about an heiress that is murdered on a luxury overnight train. This one was much more of a melodrama than Christie's other Poirot works, with the exception of the Big Four, but we don't talk about that travesty. Poirot actually had a much smaller role in this, essentially popping in to make deductions or solve the case and then pretty much vanish. It was much more focused on the cast of characters, of which there were many. I swear, the first quarter of the book was just introducing new POVs from different characters. I also thought the crime was much more complex and wide-ranging than a lot of her other novels, which tend to be more focused on smaller spaces and motives. While I did enjoy this book, I do prefer her books that face more human foibles than grand arching schemes. That being said, I might also be full of shit, because my favorite books by her are Murder on the Orient Express and Then There Were None, both of which have extremely complicated schemes. I am a little proud to say that I was able to figure out who the bad guy was, but I wasn't able to figure out how they did it at all, so, do I really deserve that win? Probably not. I honestly usually suck at deducing mystery books, so, I gotta take the little wins where they come. In the end, I did quite enjoy it and gave it a high 3. It probably helped that the last Poirot novel I read was The Big Four, The Travesty, and honestly, anything would have been better than that. I then finished Exiles by Jane Harper, the third and final book in the Aaron Falk series. This is a contemporary crime novel that takes place in Australia about a mother who goes missing during a community festival and leaving her new baby unattended in a stroller in the process. Another mystery novel! To be honest, I was getting kind of bored with them at this point, but I started them all already, so I needed to just finish them and get them out of the way. This one was fine, again. I read a lot of fine mystery novels for some reason. Very rarely do I get one that just knocks it out of the park. That being said, I will say that these books are extremely consistent. They've maintained quality really well across all 3 books in this series. And since this is the last book in the series, Harper wraps everything into a very neat little bow by the end. Like, very neat, very picture perfect. Maybe too neat. Maybe, just a little bit of unraveling. I gave this book, and honestly the series as a whole, a high 3, and would recommend this book for people who like small town insular mysteries or crime books. And honestly, if you like them, I would recommend the Samuel Craddock series by Terry Shames. That one has 10 books currently and is ongoing, although I have only read up to the 8th. So at that point, I was pretty sick of mysteries, as I'm sure you can imagine. So I picked up One to Watch by Kate Stayman-London. In One to Watch, a plus-size influencer finds self-confidence by starring as the Bachelorette, essentially. Oh god, where to start with this one? I wanted this book to be good so badly, but it was so not. I think my biggest issue is that this book is billed as a romance, but it is 100,000% a woman's fiction novel. I'm going to get a tiny bit spoilery here, and by that I mean I'm going to be mentioning plot at all, which I try to avoid doing normally, but oh my gosh, this book frustrated me so much. If you want to skip it, go ahead. I'll put a little disclaimer on the screen so that you can see when I'm talking about plot points, but the only sex scenes in this book are with men who are not the romantic lead. I don't want to read that. That's not a romance novel. Sure, it's great for her personal growth, but it has nothing to do with the romance between the characters. Like, I did not sign up for that. Plus, having to focus on so many different men because of the format of the book, the Bachelorette setting, really makes it so we can't spend very much time with any of them. Instead, they fall into stereotypical archetypes and never really expand out of that. I could never really understand how the relationships were supposed to be so deep when we nor the heroine really spent any time with any of the men. She freely admits this on page 2, that she just hasn't spent that much time with any of them. Additionally, having so many men made it confusing who to root for. I knew who the love interest was, but seeing the heroine having romantic moments with the other men confused me as to who we were supposed to be rooting for. That alone, though, probably wouldn't have been that bad, but I also just didn't think that this book went far enough on the issues that it was choosing to address. For being a book about straying from conventional beauty standards, it didn't really do anything new as a book, in my opinion. Obviously, the main point of the book is to tackle fat phobia, but the way that it did it just felt so shallow. The heroine is obsessed with how she appears to others and what they think of her for pretty much the entire book. The heroine's self-worth all centered around whether these men could find her attractive, rather than the other way around. Then all the actual character development happens off-page, so the reader just gets whiplash between her having no self-confidence to Superwoman with no build-up. It feels extremely cheap and very unearned. Plus, all the actual instances of fat phobia within the book was very surface level, of people being mean to her face, so she could just snap back with something witty. I wanted more systemic issues that she faces, and how her platform as the Bachelorette could have changed those. It felt so surface level every time it was addressed. I really wanted this book to do more and say more than it did. It had so much potential, but chose to focus on drama over depth. And for that, oh man, I'm waffling so hard between a 1 and a 2 star. I don't know, maybe a 1.5. Ugh, it was just such a disappointment. The next book I finished was When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka. This is a historical fiction book that centers a Japanese-American family that was interred in a concentration camp during World War II and the ramifications that had on them. This book would be perfect for a high school book report. It's got loads of obvious symbolism, clear literary devices, and in-your-face messaging. To be honest, it was kind of boring. I think this book would have a lot more appeal for people who are not as aware about how the US treated its Japanese citizens during World War II. If you already know about it, there isn't really anything new or groundbreaking in the text. The book is written like it's trying to convince you to care and consider these travesties as happening to real people. But if you already know that, or if you already do care, then there's nothing really to be convinced of. I did like that a lot of the focus of the book was on kind of everyday problems the characters were facing, especially since a large portion of the narrative is from children's point of views, so the mundane is likely more consuming than the overall situation for them. That's not to say they aren't aware of the situation, but they know they can't do anything about it, so they don't tend to consciously dwell on it as much as an adult would. I also like how the author played with point of view narratives to bring the reader closer and closer to the story until they are just fully enmeshed within it. One thing I did really dislike, though, was that there were multiple instances of animal abuse. There is on-page animal death and multiple cases of animal abuse based in ignorance, and none of these situations are really condemned in any way or given any kind of, negative connotations from the author, and I thought that was irresponsible. I ended up giving this one a 2 star. I don't regret reading this, but I don't think I'd recommend it unless you don't know anything about the subject already. Following that, I put down The Truth About Love by Stephanie Lawrence, book 12 in the Sinister series. In this historical romance novel, the hero has been commissioned to paint the heroine's portrait in order to absolve her of a crime that she did not commit. You know what? I'm just gonna say it. The premise here is stupid. A portrait, no matter how good, is not going to absolve anyone of a crime, even in the court of public opinion. The premise being so bonkers made the book feel incredibly unbelievable because the characters put so much stock in this absurd solution. Granted, in the world of this book, it does seem like this could be a viable way to exonerate the heroine, but it just makes the rest of the world look incredibly stupid. How am I supposed to find anything in this world believable if that is the logic that is held up as the truth? Outside of that, the plot was pretty interesting, and I was vaguely curious about where it would go. I did kind of want to know what the actual answer to the crime was, or, who did it and why. Unfortunately, the romance was where it actually dragged, and when you're reading a romance novel in spite of the romance, yikes. The hero was extremely pompous and full of himself, and the heroine was probably the blandest milquetoast non-entity I've read in a long time. They jumped into the insta-lust, which I'm fine with, pretty much immediately, but it really quickly turned into insta-love, which I'm not fine with. By the 45% mark, I realized they were just going to fall in love by messing around with each other and no actual relationship development, so I DNF'd it. I still rated it a 2 star because I got over 30% of the way in. I felt like I had read enough to gauge how good I thought the book was, but I think this will be my last attempt at Stephanie Lawrence. The last couple of books of her I've tried have all been DNFs. The heroes all read exactly the same, and I can only take so much of the same character archetype from one author before it gets just way too boring. It is a little unfortunate, though, because I remember some books earlier in the series I did quite enjoy, so it's really a pity that I'm clearly not going to enjoy any of her newer stuff. Thankfully for me, the quality of the books I started reading after that picked up considerably. So the next book I read was The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. This one is a fantasy short story collection focusing on themes of history, family, belonging, and humanness, or what makes us human. Altogether, I did find this to be an excellent short story collection. Obviously, some of the stories were stronger than others, but honestly, what collection isn't like that? On the whole, I don't think I gave any of the short stories below a low 3, which is very high for a short story collection, so I can honestly say I really enjoyed this one. The stories focused very strongly on Chinese and Chinese American experiences, specifically reconciling history with the present. I personally found the stories that fit this theme to be the most enthralling, but that may have also been because of the connection I felt to them from my own Chinese heritage. Some of the standouts were The Litomancer, about an American expat's daughter befriending an older local man during the height of kind of the Red Scare propaganda period, and All the Flavors, which focused on the experiences of a group of Chinese gold miners moving into a new town during the gold rush. The best story, though, by far and away, was the titular story, The Paper Menagerie. To be honest, when I first started this, I was like, it's 15 pages, it has so much hype, it can't possibly be that good. Then, 15 pages later, I was just sobbing into my chair. Focusing on the story between a second-generation immigrant and his first-generation mother. At the very least, I really strongly recommend reading The Paper Menagerie as a story out of the collection if you're not interested in the entire collection. The only thing that was a bit off-putting about the collection as a whole was the way that Ken Liu sometimes wrote about women in some of the stories. I found him focusing a lot on kind of the female character's beauty and breasts when introducing them.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
It wasn't in every story, so I do think it was deliberate when it appeared, but he never really talked about any of his male characters like that, outside of one story that contextually kind of needed it. So it still felt really skeevy, even if it was a deliberate choice by Ken Liu. Setting that aside, though, I did find the collection to be outstanding, and overall I gave it a 4 stars. Another thing I thought was pretty interesting was that I read this contemporaneously with The Three-Body Problem, which Ken Liu translated, and it was interesting to see all the thematic parallels between the two bodies of work. You can really see the inspiration that Ken Liu took from Cixin Liu's work and why he was chosen to translate the work. Ken Liu really has his finger on the pulse of many of the topics and issues addressed in both books, and it really shows through his writing, both from an original standpoint and from a translation standpoint. Now, obviously, from that, the next book that I completed was The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. The Three-Body Problem is a sci-fi novel about a physicist who gets sucked into the mystery of why scientists all over the world are dying when unexplainable phenomenon starts happening to him personally. I'm going to be totally honest here. Most of my notes on this one are just rants about what I thought was going on, the first half of which I was pretty off base, and the second half of which was just me exclaiming that I'd figured it out. The Three-Body Problem series is one of my partner's favorite series, so you should really feel pity for them because they had to just listen to me ranting about all of my ideas without actually being able to talk about them at all themselves. So they just got to listen to my harebrained schemes about what's happening and why it's happening and how I've connected the dots, damn it, when I clearly had not. That being said, the first half of the book was extremely engaging for me because of those elements. As a reader, you're just thrown in and you don't understand what's going on at all until the characters do, and I really love that type of storytelling. So the first half was really just my shit. It was confusing, twisty, fast-paced. I had no clue what was going on and felt like it could have been anything, which was very exciting. The second half was where it started to lose me a little bit. At this point, most of the overarching mysteries had been addressed, and from there it's mostly expository backstory and Liu's philosophy regarding science and its importance to society that's really covered in this section. On top of that, Liu is a very heavy intellectualist and blatantly looks down on non-academics or less educated people in their book, so be aware of that going in, and it can come off as very, very bigoted at certain points, because honestly, it is kind of bigoted. One thing I thought that Liu did a really good job on was connecting everything back to science. Even though there are a lot of fantastical leaps, for the most part, pretty much all of it had an explanation provided with a basis in scientific principles. So even though a lot of the plot is quite outlandish, it still came off as plausible to the reader. This book is also very, very clearly a setup book. Though there are many events and realizations in this book, very little actually happen. It's mostly just creating the setting through which I think the rest of the events of the series are going to happen. However, that premise is very promising, so I am very excited to continue on with the series, especially because the main reason I picked it up is the TV show came out on Netflix, so we want to watch it. Once I finished the first one, we were like, we can start the series, so I'll go ahead and just, start playing it, and by the second episode, I was like, crap, that's like everything that happened in the books. There's a couple things that didn't happen, but the majority of the expository parts were covered in the first 2 episodes, so I realized I'm gonna have to read the entire series before we continue on, and my partner is really raring at the bit to finish the series. So I really have to get on that. Although I've heard that Liu doesn't do a very good job writing women in the next couple books, so I'm not looking forward to that part. Overall, I gave this book a high 3. The next book I read was a bit of a switch up from there. It was Bride by Ali Hazelwood. Bride is a paranormal romance about a vampire married off to a werewolf as part of a political alliance. I think I'm officially at the point where I can say I understand the hype behind Ali Hazelwood. Her books are just super light, fluffy, and just really fun to read. She does definitely stick to the one archetype, but if you enjoy that, it's not really an issue. And no, that archetype is not Kylo Ren, because there is absolutely nothing romantic in those movies, and I will die on that hill. One thing I think Ali Hazelwood has really mastered is the quirky, witty writing style without feeling like it's trying too hard. And even though her heroine in Bride had the same voice as the heroine from Love Theoretically, they did clearly have different values and reacted to situations differently, which I did appreciate. And though they did have the same social unawareness, this character could at least figure things out, thank God. So I wasn't just sitting there screaming at my book, yelling, "What the hell are you even on about?" I also like this heroine considerably better than Love Theoretically. I think it's because of the paranormal setting. Because we're already being placed in a fantastical setting, I was more willing to suspend my disbelief for some of the more cringy and cliche relationship moments since I already had for the plot itself. The paranormal setting also allowed for the stakes to be way higher than in Hazelwood's contemporaries, which made Bride much more bingeable to me. The romance was also much more of a slow burn, which I appreciated as it's my preference. Although it does mean that all the sex is pushed to the very end, which is just unevenly bogged down with sexy times that lasted for way too long. Like, by the end of the scene, you're just bored out of your mind. I mean, there's only so many ways to put the thingy in the thingy. As for the nodding thing, I thought it was whatever. I was super into manga and fanfiction in high school and have read worse from the Omegaverse.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
I ended up having a lot of fun with this one, and it ended up being a pretty solid 4-star. Plus, the ending seemed to imply that there might be a follow-up novel, and you can bet your bottom dollar I'm going to read it if it comes out. Until then, if you liked Bride, I'd recommend the Psy Changeling books by Nalini Singh. They're a similar kind of world and are very good. I would not be at all shocked if it came out that Bride was heavily influenced by them. Plus, there's around a bajillion books in the series or so you'd be busy for a while. After Bride was Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. This is a nonfiction novella memoir biography of a woman's search for meaning via the life and work of David Starr Jordan. I did it, folks. 2 nonfictions in March. I'm officially caught up for my 2024 nonfiction reading goals. The book itself was a weird mishmash of things. I didn't know anything about this man going in, and I think that was what the author had intended for the book. Because of it, I got to see the slow hinting and then full unraveling of just how awful of a person he was. Turns out he was an extremely prominent eugenicist, so fuck him wherever in hell he's rotting. The book didn't really lose me with the subject, though, but more how the book itself is written. As I mentioned before, this book is a very strange mashup of biography, memoir, philosophical, and science book, and altogether it made for a very strange narrative experience. Especially since the book was, I think, just under 200 pages, so none of the components were particularly fleshed out just because there wasn't any time to do so. Technically, there was a through line regarding chaos as being the base state of the universe, but it felt pretty shallow and didn't really do enough to link all the disparate elements, nor really explain Miller's obsession with Jordan. On top of that, the biography ended up being incredibly subjective and very heavily affected Miller's early idolization of the man. While I didn't hate this book by any means, I also didn't really enjoy it or get anything out of it. Really, it was just a way to pass the time, so I gave it a 2-star. I then decided to DNF Crown of Feathers by Nicki Preto. This one is a YA fantasy about 2 sisters who are on a mission to become Phoenix Riders in a world where magic and Phoenix Riders are condemned. I have pretty much nothing to say about this. I need to stop picking up YA fantasies. I know I'm not going to like them. I keep holding out hope that maybe I will. I never do. Or at least I never like YA fantasies that are published post late 2000s, so like 2007, 2008 onwards. My main gripe with this one was pretty much the same reasoning that I put down the majority of YA fantasy that I read. I can't get into it. I don't know exactly what it is about like the writing style or the characterization or what, but I just have a very hard time sympathizing with the characters or caring about their plight or their story. Another thing that I had an issue with this book specifically was that I felt like early on there was very little to no actual plot. Things were happening and we had a general idea of what the characters' goals were, but there was no clear plot progression for the book to take, so I wasn't really looking forward to anything because I didn't really know what there was to look forward to. I think this is just your classic case of this book was just not for me, and that's okay. I did DNF it, and I think I need to just purge all the books similar to this from my to-read list because it's not fair to go into them already feeling like I'm not going to like it. And the final book that I read in April was The Book of Love by Kelly Link. In this magical realism novel, 3 teenagers return from the dead a year later and have to figure out why in order to avoid dying again. I like this book, but I feel like it would be a difficult one to recommend. It has a very singular flow of consciousness writing style that could definitely be off-putting to some people. It's also extremely slow and lackadaisical in its pacing. The focus is very loosey-goosey and jumps all over the place with no discernible rhyme or reason. It gave me a lot of Middle Game by Shannon Maguire vibes, but solely in the reading experience. The plot is completely different. Since the plot unfolds so slowly, the book is very much a character study, and I think it does this very well. Each character is clearly distinct from one another, and all of their actions made sense in the context in which they were done. I did definitely find the characters annoying or cringy at times, but at no point did I actually find them unbelievable. I would like to warn there is a surprisingly large amount of on-page sex, which I wasn't necessarily expecting when I started this book. It's not romanticized or extremely graphic, but it's not fade to black either. It's just kind of there. I felt pretty neutrally about it, but I know some people are not looking for that, and it's not really approached or hinted at all from the outset. The book is also over 600 pages long, and by the end I was very ready for it to be over. The ending comes pretty fast, which felt jarring after the meandering pace of the rest of the book. That being said, my positive impressions vastly outweighed my negative impressions, and I ended up rating this book as a 4-star read, which overall I thought was a pretty good way to end out the month. There are 3 other books that I read or attempted to read this month that I did not mention in my wrap-up, and that's just because 2 of them were manga. So I read Fullmetal Alchemist volumes 4 and 5. These are rereads for me. I really love this series. I think it's one of the best fantasy series I've read, novel or manga, so I do highly recommend them, but because they're rereads, I don't really talk about rereads in my wrap-up, so there you go. And the other book was The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon, which I didn't include because I think I read the prologue, which was 3 pages, and realized, what am I doing? I don't want to read this. Same principle as The Crown of Feathers. So overall, turns out that April ended up being just as slumpy as March for me, just in a different way. I read more, but the books ended up not being as good. Honestly, I preferred this month, though, because at least this way I was actually reading, and I wasn't just sitting there wanting to read and not really doing it. Plus, I have a lot of hope for May because the books that I'm currently reading are actually a lot more interesting to me already, so I'm excited to continue reading them, and I'm trying to be more conscious about the books I pick up and make sure that they're actually books that I want to read as opposed to just books that I feel like I should read. And those books that I am currently reading are Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett, the 2nd book in the Emily Wilde series, Age of Death by Michael J. Sullivan, the 5th book in the Legends of the First Empire series, and finally, Storm of Locusts by Rebecca Roanhorse, the 2nd book in the 6th World series. That's right, I finally got it back from the library, so now I'm reading it. Unlike Leviathan Wakes, which I am still 5 weeks out from getting back from the library. In regards to stats, I read 12 books this month and DNF 3, and I read 4 owned books, which is the highest month so far, so I'm very excited about that, and read 8 library books. In regards to genre, I read 2 fantasy books, 1 sci-fi book, 2 romance books, 3 mystery books, 2 literary fiction books, and 2 nonfiction, and gave a total of 3 2-stars, 3 low 3-stars, 2 high 3-stars, and 3 4-star ratings, which gave me an average rating of 2.83, which is truly atrocious. Like I said, very slumpy month. As far as my crafting goes, I was a lot more productive than last month. I'll start off with the knitting project because I have made very little progress here. I'm gonna be honest, knitting can get kind of boring after a while, especially with sleeves. I'm not really a huge fan of knitting sleeves, but I want my sweater to go all the way down to my wrist. So yeah, I'm at a bit of an impasse. On top of that, I'm pretty sure I'm going to run out of yarn, which sucks because I don't want to have to buy more. So I've kind of been procrastinating on this, and honestly, it's kind of gone back into the knitting bag for storage. I don't know when I'm going to finish this. Probably one day when I get over the fact that I have to buy more yarn for it. Until then, it will live in the back of my closet. I did, however, do more sewing this month. I ended up sewing a pair of sleep shorts, which you can see here. I like the little raccoons on them. And I also went to the Renaissance Fair a little bit earlier in the month and got a little too obsessed with those little like corset vests, but I also didn't want to pay like $200 to $300 for one. So instead I just made one. And this is what it looks like. It's a little more conservative, I think, than the Renaissance Fair ones. And by that, I specifically mean in pattern. It's not super flashy or anything, but it is reversible. So that's cool. Finally, part of the reason why I was so not interested in continuing to knit is because I really wanted to start a new cross-stitch project, which you can see here. So I did. I know you don't believe me based on my progress in the cross-stitch so far, but I do enjoy the action of cross-stitching more than I am currently enjoying the action of knitting, which is why even though this is just a block of solid color, I did want to do it more than I wanted to knit. So don't judge me too much. I like menial tasks. That's why all of my hobbies are very, very long, time-consuming menial tasks. It was really quite a productive month for me in regards to crafting. That is everything that I had for this month, though, so thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you again next month. Bye-bye!